I remember the afternoon with surprising clarity. April 28, 2012, a Saturday in late spring. Light came slanted through tall windows as if it had been asked to arrive at exactly that angle, the hum of conversation folding into itself, and the smell of coffee mixed with something sweet. Someone's lemon cake perhaps, still warm from the oven. Javier was there, grinning in that way he gets when he is proud and a little mischievous. He moved through the room like he owned a small, private joy, an emissary from a community that had learned to build things with code and patience. He introduced his mother to my mother as if presenting two colleagues at a conference, deliberate, gentle, pleased. The two women exchanged a shy smile and then, naturally, turned to the small group gathered around a table where someone was teaching two other women, both wearing headscarves, how to load a resume onto a flash drive. Seeing that filled me with an unexpected tenderness. It felt like a tiny engine of dignity kicking to life. Javier had just landed a longer-term contract with one of the local social enterprises. He had brought friends to the community center open house to show off a project they'd completed for a food co-op, a neat piece of code that solved a logistics problem that had hobbled the co-op for months. He pulled out his phone, cued a demo, and explained the architecture with a tone that married technical detail to storytelling. He spoke of queues and batch processing in the same breath as the way the software cut the co-op's delivery time and reduced spoilage. My father, who has always listened with a particular attentiveness to anything that touches timing and reliability, leaned in. He asked precise questions. When do the jobs run? How do you handle timeouts? What happens if a vehicle doesn't show up? And his questions were small telescopes training in on a piece of work. Then, in a way he had not often done when we were younger, he asked simply, "How can I help?" The question landed in the room like a small, necessary stool set down for someone to sit. It wasn't theatrical, it carried none of the heat of condescension or the flash of a performance. It was practical, an offer of wiring, of hands, of an afternoon, of steady material participation. It felt like the adult version of encouragement, not lavish praise, not rebuke, not a lecture about prudence or risk, but an openness to make something function better. That openness mattered. My mother stayed. For years she had treated the internet as a place to be wary of, an unpredictable wave best skirted rather than surfed. But that day she lingered for 3 hours, sitting in the conference room while our fellows ran a workshop teaching older adults about safe banking, how to spot a phishing email, how to use two-factor authentication, how to set up an account for automatic bill pay without surrendering control. Her concentration reminded me of the way she had learned to iron the first time she wanted a dress to look right, or of the patience she had honed when she baked bread for the first time. Practical, attentive, slowly convinced by evidence. Once or twice she mouthed something to me across the table that I couldn't decipher, and later, when people dispersed and chairs scraped back softly against the floor, she took my hand. "I didn't understand half of it," she said, squeezing my fingers as if it were a small benediction, "but I understand this. These people are building something that helps others." Her voice had a clarity that felt like a small reorientation of a long-standing impression. It was not an about-face. She did not suddenly love every line of code or sign up for a class. It was an acknowledgement, safe, specific, patient. Those 3 hours were not an epiphany but a slow accretion, the kind of time that matters because it is ordinary and sustained. That open house in 2012 sits against a larger historical backdrop. The early 2010s were years when municipal governments and community organizations were beginning to talk seriously about digital inclusion. The Edward Snowden disclosures of 2013 had sharpened public debate about privacy and online safety. Local initiatives to increase broadband access and to teach digital literacy were gaining traction. At the same time, the tech industry's growth in the previous decade, unleashed in part by the smartphone revolution after 2007, meant there were more tools but also more disparities in who could use them. Our center emerged in that context, neither the first nor the only enterprise trying to bridge gaps, but one guided by a particular insistence that technology should be designed around the constraints of the most constrained users. The summer after that April open house, by July 2012, we formalized a handful of practices that had previously lived in the soft space between impulse and routine. There had always been informal decisions: who got a little extra money for childcare, how we covered travel stipends, what to do with a modest surplus at the end of a fiscal period, but improvisation is not a foundation one wants to build on forever. The formalization was pragmatic. We created a governance structure with community representation on the advisory board and instituted a modest profit-sharing arrangement for staff who had been with us for a few years. We set aside a line in the budget for seed grants to alumni projects. Those choices stabilized relationships, made compensation more predictable, and recognized that the alumni whose ideas sprouted from our walls deserved a chance to pilot them. The decisions we made were often prosaic and granular, deciding how to allocate a surplus, whether to formalize an internship stipend, how to price the inventory sync product so it would remain accessible to small shops that had been early adopters. But administrative choices are never incidental. Together they shaped the organization's character. There was no single, tidy victory that could be polished and put away. Instead, the work behaved like a riverbed. It guided the water, found its way through the terrain, and brought long-term direction even as water levels rose and fell with seasons, grants, and local economic shocks. Recurring moral questions accompanied the structural work. One of the first temptations came in the form of an acquisition offer. On October 12, 2015, a mid-size platform company with a national distribution network approached us with an offer to buy our inventory sync product. The check would have covered several years of operating costs and allowed us to pay people better, expand the fellowship, and possibly open a second center. For a week the team debated. The temptation was practical. The money would have erased months, perhaps years, of fiscal uncertainty. But the platform's terms would have required shutting down certain low-margin services that were core to our mission. Services that kept the product useful to small retailers with thin profit margins, to community-run co-ops whose purchasing power could not compete with larger chains. We could have scaled the tool faster with their resources. We could have increased revenue and perhaps, in the short term, made the fellowship more generous. But the platform's distribution strategy would have pushed us toward customers who already had access, stores with more robust internet connections and better cash flow, and replaced local relationships with an economy of scale that felt hollow to us. So we turned the offer down. The decision was not purely sentimental. It was strategic. Payroll and rent do not accept purity, but coherence matters too. We needed the product to remain useful to the smallest shops, to the people whose networks were exactly the ones the fellowship aimed to strengthen. Choosing coherence meant accepting constraint. There were months when I took a smaller salary so we could afford to hire a program manager. During seasons when funders wavered, often tied to municipal budget cycles and shifting philanthropic priorities, we tightened belts, cutting discretionary travel, moving to less glamorous office space, postponing minor renovations. We protected the folks who depended on weekly stipends and childcare subsidies. I still remember the night we voted to extend a 6-month contract to a single mother who had been pivotal in community outreach but whose availability had been patchy because childcare circumstances were unpredictable. That decision, taken in January 2016, was a financial stretch. Some voices argued for prioritizing efficiency, hire someone with more reliable hours who would cost less in administrative overhead. I advocated for the longer commitment because she had relationships in neighborhoods we could not reach otherwise. She had trust earned over years of showing up. That 6-month contract was not measured by short-term output. It was a bet on social capital, on the multiplication of reach over time. We learned, gradually and sometimes painfully, to be modest about metrics. Funders like dashboards, charts, and clean KPIs. And beginning in 2013 we built enough of those to keep the lights on and to satisfy the professionals who steward grants. Yet we learned to measure things that could not be neatly graphed: a parent's willingness to try a public benefits website after a workshop, the week reclaimed by a student who no longer needed to commute because we helped them access remote learning, the quiet pride of a former fellow who chose to teach coding in the neighborhood high school instead of moving to a coastal tech hub. Those were stubborn victories. Their impact was not always immediate or dramatic, but they accumulated, and their cumulative weight kept the organization afloat when balance sheets looked thin. The work changed me. It eroded the binary logic I had internalized in my 20s: success versus failure, ambition versus compromise. I had once kept a ledger of relationships in my head, tallying marks and holding offenses in a complicated balance. Over time my relationships grew more porous. I learned to be faithful to people without placing them on pedestals. I learned that leadership is not the drama of constant presence, it is being present enough to be trusted and absent enough to let others grow. I started delegating decisions that had once felt like mine alone to make. That transfer of responsibility was both painful and liberating. It meant accepting that the organization would be shaped by people whose judgments differed from mine and cultivating a culture that could host those differences without imploding. The rhythm of daily life changed. Fewer frantic late nights making unilateral calls, more meetings where arguments were aired and resolved collectively. There were moments of grief that reshaped us as much as policy changes did. In late 2014, a co-founder left after a prolonged bout of burnout. In March 2019, another team member died unexpectedly, and the office became, for a time, a place of mourning. People who had been partners in strategy and comedy were suddenly absent, and their departures forced us to reconfigure budgets and headcount. We added mental health support to our benefits package in 2019, started to normalize flexible time for grieving, and built simple rituals for acknowledging absences. A quiet memorial, a shared meal, a moment in staff meetings to speak a name. The work of building, as it turned out, was also the work of making room for joy and laughter, room for failure without recrimination, room for the slow accretion of competence that repeated practice produces. Success brought new labor I had not anticipated. Invitations to speak at conferences arrived, requests for board memberships and flattering profiles in local media multiplied. I learned to be careful with publicity. By 2016, we were visible enough that one magazine offered a cover story framing our fellows as inspirational vignettes without interrogating structural issues underpinning their struggles. It would have been a tidy human interest piece, shareable and photogenic, but it would have flattened the narrative into a series of feel-good images. We declined. There were easier paths to attention and vanity metrics to chase. We chose instead to protect a culture that prized humility and competence over spectacle. That did not mean we hid. It meant measuring opportunities for visibility against whether they advanced our mission or merely served someone else's branding exercise. My sister's life moved on in its own orbit. She and her partner expanded their family in 2014 and again in 2018. Weddings, dresses, and celebratory photos populated the social media feeds that once felt like private irritation. We spoke over tea about mortgage rates and school districts. Mundane matters that, at one time, would have felt impossible to share. She once asked for help picking a nanny, and later, in a gesture that surprised me, she asked me to help set up a small online shop for the bespoke children's clothing she designed on the side. Our family history had a knot in it. The wedding where an insult had been flung that, at the time, felt like an exclamation point on a supposed failure. Over time that knot frayed. She joked once, her laughter a kind of sober absolution, that she had never really worried about my ability to make something of myself, only my ability to return a borrowed dress on time. Time teaches indistinct things. One of the clearest lessons was learning to forgive not as a singular, dramatic release but as a set of small practices, returning phone calls, making soup for someone when their child is sick, showing up for a school recital. My parents' endorsements came the same way, incremental, almost bureaucratic in their accumulation. In the winter of 2017, a college friend visited and found my mother knitting quietly in the corner of our studio while listening to a podcast about urban planning. My friend said, amused rather than surprised, "Your mother is learning about zoning." My mother looked up and replied simply, "Your friend runs a place that helps people do things. I like that." It was not thunderous applause. It was a reconfiguration of expectations. As years went on, questions about legacy surfaced. What would we leave behind, and how would the fellows who had gone through our doors remember us? These questions pushed us to embed the work beyond any one leader's tenure. In December 2018, we shifted from a founder-led grant-making mentality to a trustee model that included former fellows, local business owners, and a handful of skeptical but attentive municipal officials. We established a small endowment earmarked for core operating costs and created, 2 years later in March 2020, a rotating directorship to prevent the organization from ossifying around a single personality. What looked like bureaucratic measures were, in practice, a kind of love for the continuation of the work, love for the people who depended on it. We marked ceremonial moments that mattered to us, even if they would make for poor reportage. On September 9, 2017, we held a modest ceremony to commemorate the community center's first 100 alumni projects. We invited local shopkeepers who had been early users of our product, a city councilperson who had worked on a local digital access initiative, and neighbors who had volunteered during our earliest days. My parents sat in the front row. My father, who rarely made speeches even at family gatherings, thrust a folded note into my hand before the event. Inside he had written 3 sentences: "You built something. You did not take their path. I am proud." I read that note in dim light backstage and felt a quiet equilibrium settle, an acknowledgement less about money than about constancy. With growth came the necessity of professionalization. We had to tighten finance practices, negotiate real estate leases with landlords who read contracts like chess players, and hire HR expertise. Those tasks were tedious and often humbling, but essential. Hiring our first full-time HR manager in January 2017 changed the organization more than any pitch deck ever could. It altered how we hired, onboarded, and approached conflict resolution. We built an employee handbook that began with a commitment to transparency, pay bands, grievance procedures, and clear promotional paths. We made sure the line between mission-driven optimism and labor exploitation was enforced not by goodwill alone but by policy. In August 2016, a local school district approached us with a contract to run after-school coding programs across 10 schools. The contract was large enough to alter our scale. It demanded rapid hiring and onboarding. We took the contract because it allowed us to guarantee steadier pay for alumni who had been teaching freelance. The first semester, starting September 2016, was exhilarating and humbling. Dozens of children a week entered our classrooms to learn to build things. There was the ecstatic joy of seeing a child realize they could make something that did something. There was also the logistical strain, creating curricula flexible enough for varied age groups, ensuring quality across multiple classrooms, and managing school schedules that sometimes changed with little notice. When schedules were miscommunicated and parents were left waiting, we apologized publicly, adjusted, and invested in professional development so that fellows could transition into certified educator roles. Those months were among our hardest. Growth exposes the seams a small organization has been hiding behind. The arrival of the coronavirus pandemic in March 2020 forced a terrifying and rapid rethinking of everything. Schools closed, supply chains frayed, and our in-person workshops had to pivot overnight to remote instruction. The pandemic accelerated trends already visible: the importance of remote learning, the centrality of internet access, and the fragility of precarious employment. We used our modest endowment as a cushion. We distributed emergency funds to fellows and participants, set up equipment lending programs for students without home computers, and partnered with local ISPs and municipal broadband pilots to extend connectivity to block after block. The crisis made visible both the necessity of the work and the insufficiency of the structures that funded it. It taught us urgent lessons about resilience, that an organization must plan for shocks and that relationships and trust are the true infrastructure in times of crisis. Over time, I learned the particular grief and dignity of letting go. I stepped back from day-to-day operations not because I wanted distance, but because the organization needed different muscles than the ones I had. In May 2019, I moved into a role centered on strategy, partnerships, and fundraising, areas where my particular restlessness could still be useful without monopolizing daily life. Handing my literal desk to someone who had been sitting on a folding chair in the back for years and watching them rearrange it felt like a small miracle. They brought new priorities and new language, different ways of talking about community relationships and metrics. The organization gained resilience because it stopped orbiting a single biography. If anyone asked me to name the precise instant my parents' perception changed, I would say there was no single instant. Perception shifted gradually, microscopically, across 100 small events: a plate of marmalade sold at a fundraiser in 2014, a short exchange in a school board meeting where my mother corrected a misconception about online safety in 2015, a neighbor who used our Fellows app to manage inventory and told my sister's in-laws that their days had become slightly easier. Their view of me rearranged like weather: no grand storm, no unbroken sunshine, but in the steady accumulation of ordinary evidence that the old reasons to worry no longer held. When my father later retold that old wedding story in a way that made the room laugh, there was no sting. Not because the past was erased, but because it had been contextualized within a fuller life with meaning beyond a single insult. Now, when I read emails from fellows 20 years my junior telling me they had accepted teaching positions, or receive texts from shopkeepers saying their day feels lighter because inventory finally matches sales, I feel a quiet economy of small successes. Those confirmations are private and stubbornly important. My parents' late applause is one of those small currencies. It is not the same as grand vindication, it is a companionable recognition that, ultimately, we are judged by patterns of care more than by pronouncements at banquet halls. There is a practical ethic embedded in the story of those years, a set of habits that kept both the organization and the relationships around it alive. Build with people, not for people. Create systems that outlive the drama of any one moment. Pay your team and yourselves in ways that do not require you to be ashamed for eating. Keep a ledger for kindness as carefully as you keep one for invoices. Those guidelines are not glamorous, they are useful. They are the architecture of stamina. The wedding where I had been named a dead end exists in the same family album as the community center open house and the 100 alumni projects ceremony. One page does not cancel the other. The narrative that matters is not the anecdote that folds into a soundbite, but the life given over to repeated, ordinary acts. Those acts are small, returning a call, bringing soup, insisting on fair pay, and they accumulate into something that matters to other people. That aggregation is what turns a person from a minor footnote in someone else's story into the author of a life that has consequence for others. Because of the lessons we learned early on, we adopted concrete practices. We created clear onboarding processes so new employees would not have to navigate organizational norms through guesswork. We set up a modest but enforceable conflict resolution track so disagreements did not fester. We prioritized flexible scheduling with the explicit notion that caregiving and life complexity are not obstacles to professionalism but realities to be accommodated. I learned to ask, what does our payroll say about who we are? And to answer by aligning pay practices with stated values. These changes required both policy work and the slow cultivation of empathy. Meetings about pay bands alternated with conversations about individual situations requiring compassion and discretion. We learned how to steward growth, painfully and steadily. The 10-school contract taught us that scaling requires attention to the tight seams of quality control and relationships. We invested in teacher training, mentors for fellows who had become educators, and a curriculum review process that included community feedback from parents and local educators. We paid attention to the micro level, what students were excited to build, what assignments were infuriating, what parts of the curriculum fell flat. We engineered feedback loops so that every iteration improved the learning experience. Small improvements accumulated into trust with school districts and parents. Governance headaches remained inevitable. Moving to a trustee model raised difficult conversations about accountability and vision. Former fellows on the board brought different priorities than municipal representatives. At times the debates were painful. Should we prioritize a new app that simplified outreach or sustain a neighborhood-based counseling service that reached fewer people? Those debates exposed different kinds of value, the measurable and the relational. Over time we learned to give both kinds of value space in decision-making and to design deliberative processes that honored disagreement while producing results. Real estate was another recurring lesson. Renting and managing community space taught us the politics of place. Lease negotiations forced us to think about accessibility, zoning restrictions, and the stability of a physical home for the fellowship. We learned to read clauses and to negotiate small but important provisions. Secure storage for participant tools, an agreement on signage visibility, a commitment to affordable rent indexation. A physical space was moral infrastructure, a place where people could show up and expect a predictable environment. The decision to set up an endowment was one of our more contentious early strategic choices. Some argued funds were better used in the moment, training more fellows, buying equipment. Others favored an institutional cushion to pay for core costs when grants dried up. We compromised, a small endowment, created through consistent modest fundraising targets and seeded in December 2018, specifically earmarked for core operating expenses. It was never large, but it provided a modest runway during rough seasons. The most sincere measure of success, for me, was never accolades but small private confirmations that our work mattered. An alum who had been in the program for one fellowship year wrote in 2018 to say they had gotten a job teaching coding at a local high school and felt prepared because of our curriculum. A shop owner sent a message in 2015 unbidden, Their day felt lighter because inventory tracking no longer took up the first hour of each morning. The messages were small and unglamorous, but they accumulated like currency. They were signs that an ecosystem was forming. People connected, routines established, small institutions made easier to run because our work had smoothed a friction. To anyone who has been called a dead end or whose path has been ridiculed in a glittering room, the most durable reply is not an argument but a practice. It is the slow accumulation of small, cooperative acts. Build systems that outlast the drama of any one moment. Insist on compensation that lets people live. Keep kindness in the accounting ledger. The wedding and the open house sit within the same story because life is not a straight line of reinvention. It is an accretion of choices, habits, and small repeatable acts that eventually add up to a life that matters to other people. I do not romanticize the slow work. It involved exhaustion, missteps, and regret. We lost colleagues, funds, and sometimes faith. We were careless with relationships and had to repair the damage. We made hiring mistakes, promised things we could not keep, and sometimes prioritized scalability over craft. Those errors taught us humility. They forced us to put protective measures in place, stronger HR policies, clearer contracts, better onboarding. Over time, the cost of mistakes became visible and real, and we became better stewards because of it. There were also bright, unplanned successes. One fellow developed a small module within our inventory sync product in 2014 that allowed informal credit at the point of sale for loyal customers. The feature was clunky at first but solved a practical problem for shop owners who lacked access to formal credit lines. The module grew in use not because we had planned it as a major product but because it responded to a real need. It scaled slowly because shopkeepers trusted one another and the fellow who maintained it. Those organic developments reminded us that good design often grows from responsiveness rather than from a centralized blueprint. We tried to keep the tent wide. Inclusion was not a slogan but a daily habit. We provided childcare during evening workshops, offered stipends for transportation, and scheduled sessions at times accessible to people juggling multiple jobs. We learned to design with the margins in mind, make sure the most constrained people can participate. Doing so paid off practically because the people with the least spare time often had the most useful insights about how systems faltered in real life. Over the longer arc, what I value most is ordinariness. The routines, weekly staff meetings, monthly advisory sessions, the small rituals of welcoming a new fellow and saying goodbye when someone moves on, were the scaffolding for extraordinary events. Fundraising drama and occasional high-profile moments mattered, but they were not the spine of the organization. The spine was day-to-day commitment, showing up, paying attention, fixing skylights when they leaked, figuratively and literally. My parents' late applause is folded into that ordinariness. It was not a single declaration but a sequence of small permissions and recognitions that accumulated into a new sense of who I was in relation to them. The note my father handed me before the 2017 ceremony. You built something. You did not take their path. I am proud. Felt like the quiet majority verdict of a lifetime of small interactions. It mattered less as public validation and more as private reconciliation. If I could offer one instruction to someone starting a similar path, it would be this: treat generosity as an operational principle. That means building policies and budgets that make generosity possible, paid parental leave, modest emergency funds for staff, and real stipends for participants. It means designing systems that reward collective effort rather than promoting singular heroics. It means being willing to lose some short-term financial advantage for coherence and trust. These choices are not glamorous. They are practical. Over time, they make the difference between an organization that sputters and one that can weather seasons of scarcity. I think about the fellows 20 years my junior who now write to say they have taken jobs as teachers, organizers, and small business technologists. I think about the shopkeeper who texts about a lighter day, and the woman who received that 6-month contract and then stayed a year, bringing people into our fold who we might otherwise never have met. These measures outlast any profile or award. In the end, the story I tell is not a triumphant arc or a simple redemption narrative. It is a practice, small, repeated, ordinary acts of building and care that, together, create a life that matters to other people. That is how you go from a moment of public humiliation, a wedding insult, an offhand dismissal, to a life whose value is visible in patterns of attention and help you leave behind. The wedding exists in the same album as the community center open house. Neither erases the other. The meaningful thing is not to erase the past, but to live in a way that expands the space of useful possibilities for others. Build with people. Tend to the systems that make care possible. Keep paying attention. Over years and decades, those habits compound into something steadier than applause, a legacy of usefulness. In the years after 2018, the work settled into a rhythm that felt both precarious and dependable. We closed the year with a small endowment seeded in December 2018, and that modest cushion proved to be more than a line item in a ledger. It was an idea made real, an institutional commitment to continuity rather than theatrical growth. In 2019, we renewed several district agreements and extended our 10-school contract for another 2 years, a decision that required renewed attention to quality controls and to the local relationships that had been the foundation of the earlier contract. That year we hired 2 program directors with prior municipal experience to manage partnerships. Their skill in navigating procurement calendars and compliance requirements freed the fellows to do the adaptive work that had been the source of our strongest innovations in 2014 and 2015. The calendar shifted strikingly with the arrival of 2020. Like many small civic organizations across the country, we found ourselves confronting an interruption that reshaped how we conceived of presence and service. In March 2020, when school buildings closed and public gatherings were restricted, the modest endowment we had put in place the prior December was the difference between a rapid dissolution and a bridge to reinvention. We drew down a portion of the principal to stabilize payroll for 12 weeks and used unrestricted donations to keep stipends flowing to fellows whose other work evaporated overnight. It was messy and moral. Decisions about who received what, when, and for how long required the same balancing of measurable and relational value we had debated in trustee meetings. We also repurposed physical space funds to acquire simple digital tools. Licensing a video conferencing platform, buying basic webcams, and contracting a part-time instructional designer to translate hands-on modules into remote-friendly formats. The pandemic revealed both fragility and ingenuity. Our fellows, many of whom had been placed in schools and shops with limited bandwidth, improvised. The inventory sync module from 2014, which had always been offline-friendly, became a template for low-bandwidth design. A fellow in April 2020 created an SMS lesson platform so that students who lacked reliable internet could receive prompts and submit short assignments by text message. A single shop owner in 2015 had once told me how lighter their days felt because inventory tracking no longer took the first hour of every morning. In 2020, those same lightened hours meant the difference between staying afloat and shuttering when foot traffic dropped. The small, practical features we had built over time, low-friction credit at point of sale, a simple inventory checklist, scheduling templates, mattered disproportionately in crisis. There were losses. We lost one full-time staff member to illness and another to burnout. Our board experienced turnover as former municipal representatives who could no longer commit time stepped down and were replaced by community leaders with different priorities. The trusteeship model we had adopted earlier, which had once been the site of ideological debate, showed its value in these months. A distributed governance structure meant we could make difficult continuity decisions without overburdening a single executive. We tightened conflict resolution protocols and introduced clearer succession planning. Lessons learned from earlier mistakes that now prevented further damage. The years 2021 and 2022 were about repair and renewal. As schools reopened and cities recalibrated to a new normal, we doubled down on the practices that had sustained us: paid stipends for fellows, modest emergency funds for staff, and flexible scheduling that treated caregiving as an operational reality rather than an exception. We reopened the community space with an emphasis on hygiene and accessibility. Our lease had clauses we had insisted on in earlier negotiations: secure storage, signage rights, and affordable index rent protections, which made negotiations in 2021 less fraught. Having insisted on those provisions in an earlier era, we reaped stability when market pressures could have priced us out. We also expanded our mentorship program, pairing alumni from the early cohorts with newer fellows. Those relationships proved mutually regenerative, as the people with 10 years' experience helped translate institutional memory into tactical advice, and the newcomers brought fresh methods learned during the pandemic. Public recognition came incrementally. A regional education award named us Community Scale Innovations Practitioner in mid-2022, an acknowledgement that mattered less for the plaque than for the signal it sent to potential funders. This was an organization that could both weather scarcity and produce practical outcomes. Grants followed, not in the form of sudden windfalls but as multi-year commitments that allowed for cautious scaling. We hired a small grants manager who formalized reporting practices and, more importantly, created a narrative infrastructure that people outside our immediate neighborhood could understand. Reporting was not merely box-ticking, it was a civic document that recorded how stipends, mentoring, and low-bandwidth tools translated into concrete days where a family did not close a shop or a teacher felt equipped to lead a coding unit. My parents watched these years from a distance that was at once intimate and symbolic. The memory of the wedding, the one with the $250,000 price tag, the white-gloved servers, the offhand remark about me being a dead end, remained an inflection point in family lore. I think the wedding mattered because it crystallized a cultural choreography. There was a glittering world that valued certain professions as markers of success, and there was another world, quieter and more improvisational, where value accumulated in repetitive acts across years. The father's note in 2017, "You built something. You did not take their path. I am proud," had been an early break in that choreography. Over time their applause did not arrive as a single proclamation at a reunion but in small acts. My mother saved clippings of articles about our work. My father began to ask about fellows' families when he called. In 2022 my sister, the bride from that wedding whose reception cost $250,000, texted me a photo of a classroom we had helped refurbish and wrote, "I didn't know this is what you did. It's beautiful." The message did not undo the wedding night humiliation, but it did show that the household narrative had shifted. The more consequential shift, though, came outside the family records and inside the neighborhoods we served. By late 2022, our alumni network had matured into a loose coalition of educators, shop owners, and technologists who met monthly to troubleshoot field problems. One alum who in 2018 had written to tell us they had landed a high school coding position now chaired a peer review panel that helped us refine curricula. The market for what we did remained modest, but it was durable because it responded to concrete deficiencies. Teachers burned out less if they had a local support network. Shop owners increased survival rates when inventory started to make sense. Municipal partners could point to measurable reductions in administrative time. We also confronted new ethical questions as we became slightly larger. Partnerships with municipal agencies offered the possibility of scale but also the risk of assenting to reductive metrics. In 2023, a contract negotiation with a city department proposed replacing fellow stipends with a piece rate model tied to quantifiable outputs. The debate reopened old arguments about measurable versus relational value that had surfaced in trustee meetings years earlier. Would we make our people accountable to a dashboard or to a constellation of commitments that included caregiving accommodations and long-term relational work? After protracted deliberation, we rejected the piece rate model and proposed an alternative, a hybrid contract that tied a portion of funding to clear outputs, student contact hours, curriculum materials produced, and set aside a protected pool for relational work, for the kinds of follow-up and counseling that do not reduce easily to hourly metrics. The concession cost us some potential revenue, but it preserved the ethical architecture that had produced the trust we needed. As the organization matured, so did my sense of personal trajectory. The public humiliation at my sister's wedding had been a point of narrative friction. It was memorable because it made visible a stigma I felt all the time, that choosing steady, service-oriented work was a social failure in certain circles. The answer, I discovered over the next decade, was not to insist on being celebrated in the same currency as the glittering reception but to generate a different currency altogether. One built from trust, small reliable payments, and operational generosity. The lives that improved because of those choices were not flashy, but they were durable. There were moments of symbolic convergence. I spoke at a small municipal symposium in 2023 where a former municipal representative who had once opposed our trustee model publicly acknowledged that the combination of soft and hard metrics we practiced had improved the department's ability to reach small business owners. My parents read the transcript. Later that year, on the 10th anniversary of our founding, we held a modest public open house. My father did not make a speech, but he came early and helped set up chairs, asking practical questions about the coffee service and the heating. It was an ordinary act with disproportionate meaning. After a decade of interventions, the habits of building had reshaped even family gestures. By 2024, the organization had settled into a scale that felt survivable rather than spectacular: a core staff of 12, a rotating fellowship of 20 people a year, partnerships with roughly a dozen districts, and a small but persistent endowment that covered 3 months of operating expenses at maturity. We continued to make choices that favored coherence over flash. We codified paid family leave at 6 weeks for full-time staff in early 2024, funded by reallocating a small portion of administrative overhead. The policy was the result of long conversations about the ethics of asking staff to be caretakers without relief. We invested in a more robust HR system and retained an outside counselor for fellows navigating the stresses of frontline civic work. Looking back across a decade, patterns become visible in ways they were not in the heat of daily labor. The Inventory Sync module from 2014 became a case study for iterative product development rooted in user trust. The December 2018 endowment became the institutional proof point that small reserves can mean the difference between withering and continuing. The 2015 shopkeeper's text and the 2018 alum's coding job became nodes in a network that signaled systemic change rather than isolated success. Those patterns are comforting because they are replicable. The practices that mattered most were not charismatic leadership or sudden infusions of capital, but policies that enforced generosity and practices that honored the constraints of people's lives. There are debts and unresolved tensions that persist. We still wrestle with governance dilemmas when new funders push for metrics that favor scale over craft. We still make mistakes in hiring and sometimes fail at preserving the culture that once drew people in. We are neither a model to be idolized nor a cautionary tale. We are a stubborn example that certain choices compound. The audience that once saw me as a dead end now sees a particular kind of competence, and that is gratifying but not the same as changing the structural incentives that privileged ceremonial markers of success at my sister's wedding. The later arcs of the story, how the organization continues to manage growth pressures, how my family narrative further evolves, and how the fellows of the next decade translate these accumulated practices into new contexts, remain unwritten. I know, however, the contours of the work ahead: continued attention to how payroll reflects values, ongoing investments in mentorship so institutional memory is not lost when people leave, and a willingness to refuse funding models that force transactional choices against our ethical grain. Those contours suggest that the kind of life that can withstand a wedding room insult is less about a final vindication and more about building reversible systems that keep doing the quiet work at the next junction, and the next, and the next. By the end of 2024, the steady, patient work of the previous decade had produced not a single epiphany but a set of structural habits that guided decisions. Those habits, prioritizing relational labor, protecting stipends, codifying benefits, shaped the organization's response to the new pressures that came with slightly larger scale. In early 2025, we confronted a choice that crystallized what scale would mean for us. A metropolitan foundation with an interest in scaling local innovations offered a 3-year, $450,000 grant conditioned on expanding our fellowship program from 20 rotating fellows a year to 40 and on formalizing a metrics dashboard that prioritized quantifiable outputs, hours taught, vendor enrollments, and business survival at 12 months. The offer was tempting in practical terms. The funds would vastly increase our operating runway and allow us to hire 2 program directors, but it reopened the old fault line between measurable efficiency and the relational commitments that had produced our reputation. We took the summer of 2025 to deliberate. Between June and September, the board convened 6 times, staff held 3 all-day retreats, and alumni ran 2 facilitated listening sessions that produced both data and moral pressure. On September 23, 2025, the board voted to accept a modified version of the grant. We would take 2/3 of the funds for scaling cohort size and program infrastructure but decline the portion that required the exclusive dashboard model. Instead, we negotiated a participatory evaluation framework that combined standard indicators with narrative case studies, client journals, and quarterly peer reviews led by alumni. The foundation accepted the compromise, publicly framing the decision as a pilot in hybrid evaluation. And the work of onboarding a larger cohort began in earnest that autumn. Expanding the fellowship presented immediate operational challenges. We had to recruit more mentors without diluting the quality that made mentorship meaningful. We had to secure additional space, and we had to resolve payroll questions that only become complex when you have more people with intermittent contracts. In November 2025, we opened a modest satellite hub in a different neighborhood, a former community center whose lease we negotiated with the same protections: secure storage, signage rights, and affordable index rent that had helped us survive a decade earlier. The hub allowed us to place fellows closer to parts of the city we had only served sporadically before, and it provided an on-the-ground laboratory for testing whether our mentorship model could scale beyond a single geography. By mid-2026, the expanded fellowship, now averaging around 35 participants annually, after attrition and local adjustments, began to show patterns. The increased cohort size produced economies of scale in curriculum development. Workshops that once required bespoke facilitation could be recorded and adapted, freeing staff time for deeper coaching. Alumni networks, which by then numbered roughly 200 formally registered members from cohorts between 2014 and 2026, took on new roles: peer reviewers for grant applications, informal fundraisers at neighborhood events, and local conveners who bridged municipal offices and shop owners. That same year we formalized an alumni advisory council, with elections and term limits, to ensure that past fellows had an institutional voice in decisions about scale and ethics. The Council's first agenda item, in August 2026, was to create a protocol for fellow departure interviews, an effort to preserve institutional memory whenever people left. As the organization matured into these procedural refinements, the interpersonal landscape of family and social recognition continued to evolve in unpredictable ways. My sister, who in 2016 had presided over a $250,000 reception that marked a certain set of social values, began to show interest in our programs in a different register. In April 2026, she volunteered to speak at a community event we hosted about career transitions. Her talk was candid and practical, describing how she had navigated marriage, corporate expectations, and motherhood. The talk did not flirt with contrition about the wedding or pretend the wedding night comment had never happened. Instead, she framed her earlier worldview as one shaped by a narrow social logic that she had begun to reassess. The most striking sign of change came later that year when she offered an unrestricted gift of $25,000 toward our mentorship endowment. Small in the context of her 2016 reception budget, but symbolically large in a family ledger that had once spelled me a dead end. At Thanksgiving 2026, my parents sat at our table and spoke about that gift in a way that signaled their surprise and pride. My father, who had written the 2017 note, said only, "It seems you built a house people want to live in." Institutional life did not, of course, become a steady ascent free of setbacks. In late 2027, one of our municipal partners moved to a different administrative regime and proposed a procurement model that would have contracted us only as a deliverer of attendance-heavy workshops. The new proposal would have required us to prioritize one-off, high-participant events over the slow, iterative coaching that produced durable outcomes. After a month of negotiations, we declined. The decision cost us an expected $120,000 contract. The loss forced austerity for 6 months. We froze non-essential hires, renegotiated service contracts, and leaned heavily on volunteer alumni for program delivery. Those 6 months were a test of whether the reserves we'd built, enough, by 2024, for 3 months of operating expenses, could be treated as a buffer for strategy rather than a linchpin for survival. The test affirmed that our earlier decision to keep a small endowment had been prudential rather than indulgent. The wider civic landscape continued to matter. Between 2025 and 2028, there were shifts in city budgets and philanthropic flows as urban policy debates realigned around housing, climate resilience, and workforce development. We positioned ourselves as a micro-practitioner in those conversations. Not the voice setting policy priorities, but a proof point for how local, relationship-driven interventions could multiply impact. In 2028, we joined a coalition of neighborhood organizations forming a citywide apprenticeship program for small business operations. The coalition's work culminated in a public report in March 2029 that used a combination of our case studies and other partners' metrics to argue for baseline support for neighborhood economies. The city adopted portions of the report into its small business strategy, providing modest grants earmarked for technical assistance programs that resembled our fellowship offerings. By 2030, institutional continuity meant more than surviving funding cycles. It meant transferring the habits of craft to a new generation. That year, the Alumni Advisory Council transitioned into a semi-autonomous nonprofit incubator that operated with a shared services agreement with our organization. The incubator, staffed by 2 alumni fellows and a program coordinator, helped alumni spin off localized projects while maintaining client referrals and a shared data commons. The arrangement allowed for experimentation without entangling the mother organization in every new venture. It also created a feedback loop. When local experiments failed, the lessons returned to the parent organization as codified protocols rather than whispered regrets. Personal life continued to intersect with institutional obligations in the ways that families of civic workers know well. I married in an understated ceremony in 2025 attended by colleagues, fellows, and a small number of family members. My mother baked a familiar pie for the reception. My father quietly installed a shelf in our home office for the framed clippings she kept. Invitations evolved into an extended network that blurred familial and civic ties. Fellows who had once been service recipients became friends and peers, and family members learned to engage with work products as if they were neighborhood artifacts. There were still moments of awkwardness, holiday conversations that turned to budgets, aunts who asked why you don't publish more, cousins who confessed they still couldn't explain what we did, but the overall pattern was one of greater mutual comprehension. Ethical tensions persisted in the broader funding ecosystem. In 2029, a national donor proposed an impact accelerator model that would have centralized control over curricular materials and reserved de facto ownership of certain intellectual property produced by fellows. Our legal counsel flagged the clause as problematic. It would have compromised the open-source ethos that undergirded much of our community trust. After consultations, the board rejected the accelerator's terms. The decision cost potential visibility and a sizable grant of $300,000, but it preserved the commons that allowed fellows to reuse, adapt, and publish work without encumbering claims. The rejection also prompted several alumni to launch a low-cost open-license repository for community development tools, which by 2031 accumulated more than 100 downloadable modules. The question of scale versus craft became practical as well as rhetorical. By 2032 our core staff stabilized at about 18, and the fellowship cycle continued to average 30 fellowship placements per year, a size that felt both impactful and manageable. Municipal partnerships expanded to roughly 24 districts and neighborhood councils, while philanthropic relationships remained diverse enough to avert overdependence on any single source. We invested, incrementally, in governance infrastructure, an independent audit committee, stronger conflict of interest policies, and a rotating community oversight board that included small business owners and former fellows. Those choices were not glamorous, but they buffered the organization from the kinds of mission drift that often accompany rapid growth. At the same time, the family narrative reached a new plateau of recognition. In 2033, at a small community symposium where I was one of several panelists, my sister publicly credited our organization with helping a shopkeeper in her own building survive a pandemic-era downturn. The audience of neighbors, municipal staff, and a few distant relatives listened as she described a modest intervention, a supply chain consultation and a small stipend for temporary staff that had kept a neighborhood bakery afloat. Afterward, at a modest dinner, my father raised his glass and said, "You built something that smells like bread." The comment was both literal and metaphorical. By then the language of dead end had receded into a family lexicon of oddities rather than indictments. Beyond recognition, there were generational transitions to manage. Fellows who had joined in the early cohorts, some of whom had been teenagers when they first worked with us, now occupied middle manager roles across civic institutions. One early alum, who in 2018 had accepted a high school coding position, was by 2034 an education director in a municipal program and returned as a guest instructor for a week-long fellowship module on systems design. Another alum, whose initial success had been a privately owned shop that survived a 2015 downturn, became an advisor on procurement for small businesses seeking municipal contracts. These returns were evidence of the compounding effect. The same people who had once been beneficiaries became vectors for diffusion. Despite these gains, unresolved structural problems persisted. Labor markets remained precarious, municipal contracts often carried slow payments that strained cash flows, and national policy debates about labor protections and guaranteed income continued to create uncertainty for the people we served. We found ourselves repeatedly in the position of designing stopgap policy solutions, stipend smoothing, microloans, short-term childcare support, that addressed immediate fragility without resolving systemic precarity. The organization's role was to make life marginally more livable, to create breathing room where collective action could emerge. That kind of intervention is not the stuff of grand narratives or $250,000 receptions. It is the slow accretion of minutes and conversations. Looking ahead from the middle of the 2030s, the project remains an exercise in humility and imagination. We have plans to strengthen fiscal reserves to cover 6 months of operating expenses by 2036, to build a formal curriculum pathway with accredited partners so fellows can translate experience into recognized credentials without losing the apprenticeship quality of our work, and to institutionalize a participatory budget process so community members have a clearer say in resource allocation. Each plan comes with a timeline and a set of contingencies. Each plan will likely be adjusted as new realities, funding shifts, policy changes, demographic moves, require adaptation. The personal stakes remain entwined with the institutional ones. My parents are older now. My father takes shorter walks and is more likely to ask, when I visit, about how payroll is managed or whether the Fellows Counselor has new hours. My mother still files clippings, but the binder now includes programs from neighborhood festivals and a photograph from a 2031 graduation ceremony where a former fellow gave the keynote. My sister's trajectory is quieter and more engaged with neighborhood life. She sponsors an annual scholarship for fellows' childcare costs and has become a regular donor to our mentorship endowment. These gestures do not erase prior humiliations. They transmute them into new, mundane acts of support that matter precisely because they are ordinary and recurrent. What feels most important, as we continue toward a later conclusion that remains unwritten, is the capacity to make institutional choices that are reversible and accountable. The interventions that have lasted, paid leave, modest reserves, alumni governance, are those that introduced frictions against short-term incentives. They did not insulate us from every challenge, but they made it possible to survive and learn. The story that began with a wedding room insult and a father's tentative note in 2017 has evolved into a longer, more complicated arc in which family recognition is neither the objective nor the sole measure of value. Instead, the measure has become whether the systems we build allow other people to carry on, to fail safely, and to try again with dignity. The next chapters will be about preserving that capacity at larger scales, about converting small victories into durable public goods, and about teaching the next cohort of leaders how to prefer coherence over flash so that when the inevitable new pressures arrive there will be tools, precedents, and people ready to make the same stubborn decisions.